I'm sure they can find you something more appropriate. Victoria Hartwell said, her voice dismissing the man in the hoodie before her. To her, he was just a black man who didn't belong in her first-class world. She had no way of knowing this man was Devin Mitchell, the CEO, who owned 65% of the entire airline. Every condescending word was sealing her fate. She thought she was putting him in his place. Instead, she was earning a lifetime ban from the very airspace owned by the man whose dignity she was challenging. Victoria Hartwell didn't even look up from her phone initially. Her perfectly manicured fingers continued scrolling through what appeared to be luxury real estate listings, each property worth more than most people's annual salaries. When she finally raised her head, her blue eyes swept over Devin with the kind of dismissive assessment that wealthy white women had perfected over generations. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that came naturally to someone who had never been told no in her life. "I'm sure we can work something out. Perhaps you could find another seat. I've already gotten quite comfortable here." Devin was tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from 3 days of back-to-back investor meetings in Manhattan, where he'd spent countless hours explaining why Skyche Innovations deserved their money, proving his worth in conference rooms where he was often the only black face at the table. His casual attire, a black hoodie, dark jeans, and expensive sneakers that most people wouldn't recognize as costing more than their monthly rent, was a deliberate choice. After years of suits and ties, sometimes a man just wanted to travel in comfort. But comfort, Devin was learning, was a luxury that came with conditions when you looked like him. "Ma'am," Devin said, his voice remaining level, despite the familiar surge of frustration rising in his chest. "This is seat 2A, according to my boarding pass. This is my assigned seat." Victoria finally turned her full attention to him, and Devin caught something in her expression that he'd seen countless times before, a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed disdain. It was the look that said, "People like you don't belong in places like this." "Well, yes, I can see that," she replied, gesturing vaguely at the boarding pass in his hand. "But surely you understand that mistakes happen. I'm a Pinnacle Platinum member, and I specifically requested a first-class window seat. I'm sure if you speak to the flight attendant, they can find you something more appropriate." The word appropriate hung in the air like a challenge. Devin felt the familiar weight of it, the coded language that had followed him through Harvard Business School, through every boardroom negotiation, through every interaction where his presence was questioned simply because of the color of his skin. Behind him, other passengers were beginning to notice the holdup. A few craned their necks to see what was causing the delay, while others pointedly looked away. The universal sign of people who didn't want to get involved in what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. Devin glanced at his watch, a PC Felipe that had been a gift to himself after Skitech's IPO, though it remained hidden beneath his hoodie sleeve. The gesture wasn't about checking time. It was about maintaining composure. In his backpack was a laptop containing emails that could move millions of dollars with a single keystroke, contracts that employed thousands of people, and strategic plans that could reshape entire industries. But none of that mattered in this moment, because to Victoria Hartwell, he was just another black man who didn't know his place. "I understand your concern," Devin said carefully, "but this is my seat. I'd appreciate it if you could check your boarding pass and find your correct assignment." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "My dear, I think you're confused about how things work here. This is first class, not..." She paused, letting her eyes travel over his casual clothing once more. "Well, not where people usually dress so casually." The words hit exactly as they were intended to. Devin had heard variations of this theme his entire adult life, the questioning of his credentials, the assumptions about his background, the subtle and not so subtle suggestions that he didn't belong in spaces of privilege and power. What Victoria didn't know, what nobody on this plane knew, was that Devin Mitchell wasn't just another passenger. 3 years ago, through a complex series of acquisitions orchestrated by his company, Skitech Innovations, he had quietly become the majority owner of Pinnacle Airways. 65% of the airline belonged to him, from the planes to the routes to the very seat that Victoria Hartwell was now refusing to vacate. But Devon had learned long ago that revealing power too early often led to accusations of arrogance or intimidation. Better to let situations reveal their true nature first to see who people really were when they thought there would be no consequences for their actions. "I'm not confused about anything," Devon replied, his tone remaining steady but gaining an edge that made a few nearby passengers look up from their phones. "This is my seat, and I'd like you to move." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she clearly viewed as beneath her social station. Her voice dropped to what she probably thought was a reasonable tone, but it carried the unmistakable accent of someone who had grown up with old money and older prejudices. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here, but I'm not moving. I've been flying Pinnacle for 12 years, and I know how these things work. If there's been some kind of error with the seating arrangements, I'm sure the airline will sort it out in a way that makes sense for everyone involved." The implication was crystal clear. Someone like Devon didn't deserve to be in first class, regardless of what his boarding pass might say. It was the kind of casual racism that Victoria probably didn't even recognize in herself, wrapped in the language of reasonableness and procedure. Devon felt his phone buzz in his pocket, probably Kai, his assistant, wondering why he hadn't checked in yet. There were emails to answer calls to return decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. But all of that faded into the background as he stood in the aisle of his own airplane, being told by a woman who had likely never worked a day in her life that he didn't belong in a seat. He had not only paid for, but technically owned. The moment stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken implications. Other first-class passengers had stopped pretending not to watch their eyes darting between Devon and Victoria like spectators at a tennis match. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few wore expressions that suggested they were already choosing sides based on nothing more than appearance and assumption. Devon made his decision. This wasn't going to be one of those times when he quietly moved to keep the peace. Not today. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a new authority that made Victoria's confident smile falter slightly. "I'm going to ask you one more time to move. This is my seat, and I intend to sit in it." Victoria Hartwell's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched in what she clearly intended to be an intimidating expression. Her Louis Vuitton handbags sat in the seat beside her like a territorial marker, while shopping bags from Bergdorf Goodman and Saks Fifth Avenue occupied the floor space around her feet. Everything about her posture screamed ownership, not just of the seat, but of the entire first-class cabin and everyone in it. "I'm sorry, but I think you're misunderstanding the situation," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone that wealthy white women used when they wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. "I'm Victoria Hartwell. Perhaps you've heard of Hartwell Properties. We develop luxury residential communities throughout the Northeast. I'm not some random passenger. I'm a VIP customer, and I specifically requested this seat." Devon remained standing in the aisle, his boarding pass still in his hand, watching as Victoria performed what was clearly a well-rehearsed routine. He'd seen it before in boardrooms and networking events. The casual named, dropping the assumption that credentials and connections could override basic fairness and decency. Mrs. Hartwell, Devon said, emphasizing her name to show he'd heard it. "I'm sure you're very important in your line of work, but importance doesn't change seat assignments. This is 2A, and that's what my boarding pass says." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind of sound that suggested she found the entire situation absurd. "Oh, sweetheart, you're taking this far too seriously. Look around you. Does this seem like the kind of mistake that usually happens? I mean, really, when was the last time you flew first class?" The question hung in the air like a slap. It was designed to humiliate, to force Devon to admit that he didn't belong, that this was all some kind of mistake or misunderstanding that a simple conversation could resolve. Victoria's eyes glittered with the confidence of someone who had never been told that her assumptions about other people might be wrong. But Devon had been in enough high-stakes negotiations to recognize a power play when he saw one. Victoria wasn't confused about seat assignments. She was establishing dominance testing to see if he would back down when faced with her social credentials and obvious wealth. "I fly first class every week," Devon replied calmly. "Usually on this same route, and in 3 years of flying Pinnacle Airways, I've never had someone refuse to move out of my assigned seat." Victoria's smile became more strained. She hadn't expected him to push back with such quiet confidence, and Devon could see her recalculating the situation. Her eyes swept over him again, taking in his casual attire and young face, clearly trying to reconcile his composed demeanor with her preconceptions about who belonged in first class. "Well then, surely you understand how these things work," she said, her tone becoming more aggressive. "Sometimes accommodations need to be made. I have a connecting flight in Los Angeles, and I specifically need a window seat on the left side of the plane for the view. I'm sure Pinnacle can find you another seat that meets your needs." Devon felt his phone buzz again. This time, he glanced at it quickly. A text from Kai that read, "Board meeting moved to 2 p.m. PST. Need you on the ground by noon. Everything okay?" Everything was definitely not okay, but not in the way Kai would expect. Devon typed back quickly, "Flight delayed. Handle the prep calls. We'll be there." When he looked up, Victoria was watching him with renewed interest. "Important business?" she asked, and there was something almost mocking in her tone. "I do hope we're not keeping you from anything too urgent." "As a matter of fact," Devon said, slipping his phone back into his pocket, "I do have important business, which is why I'd like to get settled in my assigned seat, so we can take off on time." Victoria's expression hardened. The polite veneer was starting to crack, revealing something uglier underneath. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, leaning forward slightly. "I don't know what kind of scheme you're running here, but I'm not playing along. I know exactly what you're trying to do. Make a scene 'cause of fuss. Probably hoping for some kind of compensation or upgrade. Well, it's not going to work with me." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Devon felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever someone suggested that his legitimate presence in spaces of privilege was somehow fraudulent or opportunistic. It was the same assumption that had followed him through his entire career, that a successful black man must be running some kind of con game. Mrs. Hartwell Devon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "I'm not running any scheme. I'm not looking for compensation or an upgrade. I'm simply trying to sit in the seat I paid for on the airline ticket I purchased legally and legitimately. If that threatens you somehow, that's your problem, not mine." Victoria's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone she clearly viewed as socially inferior. Her voice rose slightly loud enough that passengers in nearby rows couldn't help but overhear. "Threatens me. Don't flatter yourself. I'm trying to resolve this situation quietly and reasonably, but you're being deliberately difficult. I've offered you multiple alternatives, and you're refusing to be flexible. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Devon almost smiled at that. If Victoria Hartwell wanted to talk about character, they could certainly have that conversation. But not here. Not like this. Not when she was still operating under the assumption that she held all the power in this interaction. "My character," Devon repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words. "Tell me, Mrs. Hartwell, what exactly does my character have to do with your refusal to move out of my assigned seat?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she reached for the call button above her head and pressed it firmly. The soft chime echoed through the first-class cabin, and Devon could see other passengers turning to watch what was clearly escalating from a simple misunderstanding to something more confrontational. "I think it's time to get the flight attendant involved," Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Obviously, we need someone with authority to resolve this situation properly." Devon nodded slowly. "I think that's an excellent idea," he said. "Let's get someone with authority involved." The irony of that statement would become apparent soon enough. The soft footsteps of regulation airline shoes on carpeted flooring announced the arrival of Sarah Chen, a 29-year-old flight attendant whose perfectly pressed uniform and practiced smile suggested she'd handled her share of passenger disputes. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes moved quickly between Devon and Victoria, already assessing the situation before she'd heard a word from either party. "Good afternoon," Sarah said, her voice carrying the trained cheerfulness of someone who had learned to diffuse tensions before they exploded into full-scale incidents. "I understand there's some confusion about seating arrangements. How can I help resolve this for you?" Victoria immediately leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of an aggrieved victim who had been suffering in silence until forced to speak up. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Victoria Hartwell, Pinnacle Platinum member for over 12 years. I've been sitting in this seat which I specifically requested when I booked, and this gentleman is claiming it's his." Sarah's eyes flicked to Devon, and he caught something in her expression that he'd seen countless times before. It wasn't malicious exactly, but it was telling a subtle shift that suggested she was already forming assumptions about who was likely telling the truth and who was likely causing trouble. So Sarah said, turning to Devon with a smile that was noticeably less warm than the one she'd given Victoria, "May I see your boarding pass?" Devon handed it over without comment, watching as Sarah examined it carefully. Her frown deepened as she looked from the boarding pass to the seat number above Victoria's head, clearly seeing that Devon was in fact assigned to 2A. "Well," Sarah said slowly, "it does appear that this seat is assigned to you, mister." She glanced at the boarding pass again. "Mr. Mitchell, however, I can see that Mrs. Hartwell is already settled in, and she does have a very high status with our airline." Devon felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen this dance before. The careful diplomatic language that somehow always seemed to suggest that the black passenger should be the one to compromise, to be flexible, to understand that maintaining harmony was more important than maintaining his rights. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Devon asked quietly. Sarah's smile became more strained. "Well, we do have several other excellent seats available in first class. Perhaps we could move you to 3C. It's an aisle seat with excellent legroom, and I'd be happy to make sure you receive priority service throughout the flight as compensation for the inconvenience." "The inconvenience," Devon repeated slowly. "You mean the inconvenience of someone else sitting in my assigned seat?" Victoria sensed an opening and took it. "I think that's a very reasonable solution," she said quickly. "I've already arranged my belongings here, and as I mentioned, I have specific needs related to my connecting flight. I'm sure Mr. Mitchell understands that sometimes flexibility is required when traveling." Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Mrs. Hartwell does have a point. These kinds of mix-ups happen occasionally, and we found that the best solution is usually the one that accommodates everyone's needs with minimal disruption." Devon looked around the first-class cabin. Several passengers were now openly watching the exchange, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. He could see an older black couple in row 4 who were watching with expressions that suggested they knew exactly what was happening and had probably experienced similar situations themselves. In row 3, a Latina woman with a press badge clipped to her jacket was watching intently, her phone discreetly positioned as if she might be recording. Her dark eyes met Devon's for a moment, and he caught something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the understanding that this was about more than just a seating dispute. Near the window in row 5, a young Asian woman with multiple electronic devices was definitely recording, though she was trying to be subtle about it. Her fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, and Devon could see the telltale glow of a live stream interface. "I appreciate the suggestion," Devon said, finally turning back to Sarah. "But I'd like to sit in my assigned seat. The seat I paid for. The seat that's clearly marked on my boarding pass." Sarah's professional smile began to crack slightly. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand your position, but I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Mrs. Hartwell is one of our most valued customers and I'm not." Devon interrupted gently. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly realizing that any answer she gave would be problematic. Victoria, however, had no such hesitation. "Oh, please," she said with a dismissive wave. "This is ridiculous. I've been a Pinnacle customer for over a decade. I fly first class on this route at least twice a month. I know the crew, I know the procedures, and I know how these things are supposed to work. She turned to Sarah with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that her complaints would be taken seriously. I specifically requested this seat when I booked. If there's been some kind of computer error or overbooking situation, that's not my problem to solve. I'm already seated. I'm already settled, and I have no intention of moving. Devon felt his phone buzz again. Without looking at it, he could guess it was another message from Kai, probably wondering about the delay. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was getting updates about his own airline while being told by one of his own flight attendants that he should give up his seat to keep a racist customer happy. Mrs. Hartwell Devon said his voice still calm, but gaining an edge that made several nearby passengers look up. You keep talking about how long you've been a Pinnacle customer. Let me ask you something. In all those years of flying with this airline, how many times have you refused to move out of someone else's assigned seat? Victoria's eyes flashed with anger. I'm not refusing anything. I'm sitting in the seat I booked exactly as any reasonable person would expect to do. Except you didn't book this seat, Devon pointed out. If you had, you'd have a boarding pass that showed 2A. Instead, you're just sitting here and hoping that your status as a valued customer will let you take whatever you want. Sarah stepped between them, clearly sensing that the situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage with standard customer service protocols. Gentlemen, ladies, let's all take a step back here. I'm sure we can work this out without anyone getting upset. I'm not upset, Devon said quietly. I'm just tired of being told that other people's comfort is more important than my confirmed reservation. Victoria laughed a sharp sound that carried clearly through the cabin. Your confirmed reservation. Please, we both know what this is really about. You're hoping to create enough of a scene that you'll get some kind of compensation or special treatment. Well, I've seen this act before, and it's not going to work. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Devon felt every eye in the first-class cabin turned toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to being called a fraud and a manipulator in front of a plane full of strangers. He looked at Victoria for a long moment, then at Sarah, then at the passengers who were watching with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear him. You have no idea what you just started. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted from uncomfortable to electric. Victoria Hartwell's accusation that Devon was running some kind of compensation scheme had crossed a line, and everyone present seemed to sense that they were no longer witnessing a simple seating dispute, but something much more significant. Sarah Chen looked between the two passengers with growing alarm, clearly realizing that her standard conflict resolution training hadn't prepared her for this level of tension. Her hand moved instinctively toward the phone that would connect her to the cockpit, but she hesitated, uncertain whether the situation warranted escalating to the captain's level. Perhaps Sarah said, her voice strained with forced cheer. I should get Captain Rodriguez involved. He has more authority to handle these kinds of complex situations. Victoria's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. Yes, I think that's an excellent idea. Let's get someone in charge who can explain proper procedures to Mr. Mitchell here. Devon nodded slowly. Please do. I'd very much like to speak with someone in authority. As Sarah hurried toward the cockpit, the silence in the cabin was broken by a clear professional voice from row 3. Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing what just happened here. All eyes turned to Elena Vasquez, the Latina woman with the press badge. She was in her mid-40s with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of asking difficult questions in hostile environments. Her business card, which she now held up for everyone to see, identified her as a senior correspondent for the Washington Post. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I cover transportation and civil rights issues for the Post. I've been watching this entire interaction, and I have to say, Mrs. Hartwell, your behavior has been absolutely inappropriate from the beginning. Victoria's mouth fell open. Excuse me, I beg your pardon, but this is none of your business. Elena smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Actually, discrimination in public accommodations is very much my business. I've covered dozens of cases like this, and I can tell you exactly what I'm seeing here. A black man with a legitimate boarding pass is being told to give up his seat to accommodate a white woman who has no boarding pass for that seat simply because she claims to be a valued customer. The young woman in row 5, Zoe Kim, though nobody knew her name yet, lowered her phone slightly and spoke up. I've been live streaming this whole thing to my followers. We're up to about 500 viewers now, and let me tell you, the comments are not kind to you, lady. Victoria whirled around to face Zoe, her face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. You've been filming this. You can't do that. I don't consent to being recorded. Zoe shrugged a gesture that managed to convey both innocence and defiance. Actually, this is a public space, and I'm documenting what appears to be a civil rights violation. My viewers are very interested in what's happening here. Civil rights violation, Victoria sputtered. This is a seating dispute. You people are blowing this completely out of proportion. The phrase, you people, hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Several passengers audibly gasped, and Devon felt something shift in his chest. Not anger exactly, but a cold, calculating focus that he recognized from his most challenging business negotiations. Elena Vasquez was already typing notes on her phone. Did you just say, you people, Mrs. Hart? Well, in the context of a discussion about racial discrimination, I want to make sure I quote you accurately. Victoria realized her mistake immediately. That's not what I meant. I was referring to journalists and social media people, I'm not a racist. Devon spoke for the first time since Sarah had left to get the captain, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. Mrs. Hartwell, you've now accused me of running a compensation scheme, suggested that I don't belong in first class, and used the phrase you people when describing those who are documenting your behavior. If you're not a racist, you're doing an excellent impression of one. How dare you, Victoria shot back. I have black friends I donate to charity. I would never. You would never. What? Elena interjected. Assume that a black man in casual clothes doesn't belong in first class because that's exactly what you did. Suggest that his presence in your preferred seat is somehow fraudulent because that's exactly what you said. Refuse to acknowledge his legitimate boarding pass while insisting on your own imaginary rights, because that's exactly what's happening right now. Before Victoria could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Captain James Rodriguez, a 52-year-old veteran pilot whose weathered face and graying temples spoke to decades of experience dealing with difficult situations at 30,000 FT. Behind him walked Sarah Chen, looking relieved to have passed the problem up the chain of command. Good afternoon, everyone. Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. I understand we have a seating issue that needs to be resolved quickly so we can maintain our departure schedule. Victoria immediately stood extending her hand with the gracious smile of someone confident that authority figures would naturally take her side. Captain Rodriguez, thank you so much for coming. I'm Victoria Hartwell, Pinnacle Platinum member. I'm afraid there's been some kind of computer error with the seat assignments, and this gentleman is being quite unreasonable about finding a solution. Captain Rodriguez shook her hand politely, then turned to Devon. And you are Devon Mitchell. Devon replied, not offering his hand, but maintaining steady eye contact. This is my boarding pass, showing my assignment to seat 2A. Mrs. Hartwell has been sitting in my seat since boarding and refuses to move despite having no boarding pass for this seat. The captain examined Devon's boarding pass carefully, then looked around the first-class cabin, taking in the watching passengers and the obvious tension in the air. Mr. Mitchell, I can see that you're assigned to this seat. However, Mrs. Hartwell is a valued long-time customer, and I'm sure we can find an accommodation that works for everyone. Devon felt the familiar disappointment that came with watching people in authority positions choose the path of least resistance rather than simple fairness. Captain, what accommodation would you suggest that I give up the seat I paid for so that Mrs. Hartwell can sit wherever she chooses? Captain Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Well, we do have other available seats in first class. Sometimes these situations require a little flexibility from everyone involved. Elena Vasquez spoke up from her seat. Captain Rodriguez, I'm Elena Vasquez from the Washington Post. Are you seriously suggesting that Mr. Mitchell should give up his assigned seat simply because Mrs. Hartwell doesn't want to move? Because if that's Pinnacle Airways' official policy, I'd like to get that on record." The captain's eyes widened as he recognized the implications of having a national journalist witness and document the situation. "Ma'am, this is just a simple customer service issue. We're trying to find a solution that makes everyone comfortable. Comfortable for whom Elena pressed? Comfortable for the white woman who took someone else's seat? Or comfortable for the black man who's being asked to give up his rights to avoid conflict?" Zoe Kim lowered her phone so everyone could see the screen. "My viewers are asking if this is how Pinnacle Airways normally handles discrimination complaints. We're up to over 1,000 people watching now, and someone just shared it to Twitter. The hashtag Pinnacle Shame is starting to trend." Captain Rodriguez looked around the cabin with growing alarm, clearly realizing that what had started as a simple passenger dispute was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. "Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that Pinnacle Airways does not discriminate against anyone. We're simply trying to resolve a seating conflict." Devon stood up slowly, his full height, making him an imposing presence in the narrow confines of the first-class cabin. When he spoke, his voice carried a new edge that made everyone pay attention. "Captain Rodriguez, let me be very clear about something. Mrs. Hartwell is sitting in my seat. She has no boarding pass for this seat. She has refused multiple requests to move. Your flight attendant suggested that I should be the one to relocate despite having the legitimate seat assignment. You've now endorsed that same suggestion. At what point does this stop being customer service and start being discrimination?" The captain opened his mouth to respond, but Devon held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. Mrs. Hartwell has accused me of running a compensation scheme suggested that people like me don't usually fly first class and used the phrase "you people" when describing those who object to her behavior. All of this has been witnessed by multiple passengers and recorded by at least one of them. So let me ask you directly, Captain Rodriguez. Is it Pinnacle Airways policy that white passengers can take any seat they want as long as they claim to be valued customers?" The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on Captain Rodriguez, waiting to see how he would respond to being put on the spot so directly and publicly. Finally, Victoria Hartwell broke the silence with a laugh that sounded more like a shriek. "This is insane. I refuse to be lectured by someone who probably got his ticket through some kind of affirmative action program or diversity initiative. Real first-class passengers don't dress like they're going to the gym." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped audibly, and Devon felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. Elena Vasquez was typing furiously on her phone. "Mrs. Hartwell, did you just suggest that Mr. Mitchell couldn't have legitimately purchased a first-class ticket? And did you reference affirmative action in the context of airline seating?" Victoria realized she'd gone too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "I'm just saying that there are procedures for these things, and people who belong in first class generally understand how to dress appropriately and behave with some decorum." Devon looked at her for a long moment, then at Captain Rodriguez, then at the dozen or so passengers who were watching with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the cabin. "Captain Rodriguez, I need to ask you to ground this aircraft immediately." Captain Rodriguez blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell, but did you just ask me to ground the aircraft?" "I didn't ask." Devon replied, his tone still conversational, but carrying an unmistakable authority that made several passengers sit up straighter. "I told you ground this aircraft. We're not taking off until this situation is properly resolved." Victoria Hartwell laughed a sound that was becoming increasingly shrill with each exchange. "Oh, this is rich. Now he thinks he can give orders to the captain. What's next? Are you going to demand they roll out a red carpet for you?" Captain Rodriguez looked genuinely confused. In 30 years of flying, he dealt with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and weather delays, but he'd never had a passenger simply order him to ground a flight. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate that you're frustrated, but passengers don't have the authority to make operational decisions about aircraft. Devon reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Captain, I'm going to make a phone call. I suggest you listen very carefully to what happens next." Elena Vasquez leaned forward in her seat, her journalist's instincts telling her that something significant was about to happen. Zoe Kim adjusted her phone to get a better angle, her viewer count now climbing past 1,500 as word of the confrontation spread across social media. Devon tapped his phone screen a few times, then held it up so everyone could see. Instead of making a call, he had opened an app that none of the passengers recognized. A sleek interface with the Pinnacle Airways logo at the top and what appeared to be various operational controls below it. "What is that?" Sarah Chen asked, stepping closer to get a better look at the screen. Devon's finger hovered over a button labeled Ground All Flights CEO Override. This Ms. Chen is the executive control panel for Pinnacle Airways operations. And this, he tapped the screen, is what happens when someone pushes a CEO too far. The app processed for a moment, then displayed a confirmation message. Flight 11847. Grounded by owner directive. Return to gate immediately. Captain Rodriguez's radio crackled to life almost instantly. Flight 11847. This is Tower Control. We're showing a CEO override order on your flight. Please confirm your status and return to gate immediately. The captain stared at his radio, then at Devon, then back at his radio. Tower, this is Captain Rodriguez. Can you repeat that message? Did you say CEO override affirmative captain? We're showing an order directly from Skype Innovations corporate office to ground your flight immediately. You're cleared to taxi back to gate C7. Victoria Hartwell's face had gone pale. What just happened? What did you do? Devon pocketed his phone and looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. Mrs. Hartwell, allow me to properly introduce myself. My name is Devon Mitchell. I'm the CEO of Skytech Innovations, which owns 65% of Pinnacle Airways. In other words, I don't just have a seat on this airplane, I own the airplane. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the low hum of the aircraft's environmental systems. Every passenger in the first-class cabin stared at Devon as if he had just announced that he was from Mars. Elena Vasquez was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying the excitement of a journalist who had just stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. You're Devon Mitchell, the Skytech CEO, the one who's been on the cover of Forbes and Fortune, the guy who revolutionized airline booking systems. Devon nodded, the same. And Mrs. Hartwell, since you were so curious about my qualifications to sit in first class, I should mention that Skytech software powers the reservation system that processed your ticket, the check-in kiosks you used at the airport, and the passenger manifest that Captain Rodriguez has been consulting throughout this conversation. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But you're dressed you look like what Mrs. Hartwell Devon asked quietly, like someone who doesn't belong in first class. Like someone who couldn't possibly afford to buy his own airline. Like someone whose presence in spaces of wealth and power must be the result of fraud or charity. Captain Rodriguez had gone silent, presumably processing the fact that he had just spent the last 20 minutes suggesting that the owner of his airline should be more flexible about giving up his seat. His radio crackled again. Captain Rodriguez, this is Pinnacle Operations. We need you to return to the gate immediately. There's going to be a corporate representative meeting the aircraft, and we need all passengers to remain on board until further notice. Sarah Chen looked like she was about to be sick. Mr. Mitchell, sir, I had no idea. You were trying to make the problem go away by asking the black passenger to be accommodating. Devon finished for her. I understand, Ms. Chen. It's what you've been trained to do. Find the person who looks like they have the least power and ask them to compromise so that the person who looks like they have the most power doesn't have to be inconvenienced. Zoe Kim's phone was buzzing with notifications as her live stream exploded across social media. Holy shit, she whispered, then caught herself. Sorry, this is incredible. The viewer count just jumped to over 5,000. Someone shared this to TikTok, and it's already got 10,000 views. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. I didn't know. I mean, how was I supposed to... Supposed to what? Elena Vasquez interjected her pen, moving rapidly across her notepad. Treat him with basic human respect. Accept that he had a legitimate boarding pass, not assume that a black man in casual clothes must be running some kind of scam. Devon felt his phone buzz and glanced at it quickly. A text from Kai read, "Devon, what the hell is happening? Social media is exploding. Something about you grounding a flight. Call me immediately." Instead of calling Kai, Devon typed back quickly. "Handle all media inquiries. Draft statement about discrimination in air travel. Schedule emergency board meeting for this afternoon. This is going to be big." As the aircraft began its taxi back to the gate, Devon looked around the first-class cabin at the faces staring back at him. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed, and a few seemed excited to be witnessing what was clearly going to become a major news story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Devon announced, his voice carrying easily through the cabin. "I want you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't about me. It wasn't about my airline or my money or my position. It was about what happens every day to people who look like me when they try to exist in spaces where they're not expected to belong." He looked directly at Victoria, who was now slumped in her seat as if trying to disappear. Mrs. Hartwell refused to acknowledge my legitimate boarding pass because she couldn't believe that someone like me belonged in first class. "Ms. Chen suggested that I should be the one to move because it would be easier than making a valued customer face consequences for her actions. Captain Rodriguez endorsed that suggestion because he assumed that I would be the reasonable one, the one who would compromise to keep the peace." The aircraft came to a stop at the gate, and Devon could see through the windows that a small crowd was gathering on the jet bridge. Some appeared to be airport officials. Others looked like reporters who had somehow gotten word of the story. Every single assumption made about me today was based on nothing more than the color of my skin and my choice to wear comfortable clothes while traveling. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly the kind of discrimination that I intend to make sure never happens again on any aircraft that I own. Victoria Hartwell finally looked up from her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were. I never meant..." Devon's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Mrs. Hartwell, that's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you felt entitled to treat me as less than human. The issue isn't that you didn't recognize me as a CEO. The issue is that you didn't recognize me as a person deserving of the same respect you'd want for yourself." As the jet bridge connected to the aircraft and the doors opened, Devon stood and gathered his belongings. The first-class cabin remained silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Captain Rodriguez," Ms. Chen Devon said as he prepared to exit, "I'll be speaking with you both individually very soon. Mrs. Hartwell, you'll be hearing from our legal department regarding your permanent ban from all Pinnacle Airways flights." He paused at the aircraft door and turned back to face the cabin one more time. "And to everyone else who witnessed what happened here today, thank you. Your attention and your willingness to document the truth are the only reasons this story will be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away." With that, Devon Mitchell walked off his own airplane, leaving behind a cabin full of people who were still trying to process what they had just experienced. The jet bridge buzzed with controlled chaos as Devon stepped off the aircraft. Airport security personnel flanked both sides of the walkway, while a small group of what appeared to be Pinnacle Airways executives huddled near the gate counter, speaking in urgent whispers. Beyond them, Devon could see several people with cameras and notepads who had somehow materialized in the 30 minutes since his flight had been grounded. But it was the young black man in an expensive suit who caught Devon's attention first. Kai Johnson, his 26-year-old assistant, was practically vibrating with nervous energy as he approached his phone pressed to his ear and a tablet tucked under his arm. "Devon, thank God," Kai said, ending his call quickly. "I've been fielding calls for the last 20 minutes. The story is everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, even CNN just picked it up. What the hell happened up there? Devon glanced back at the aircraft where passengers were slowly deplaning under the watchful eyes of airport security. Victoria Hartwell emerged looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Her designer clothes rumpled and her perfect makeup stray with tears. Behind her came Elena Vasquez, who was already on her phone, presumably calling in the story to her editors at the Washington Post. "What happened?" Devon said quietly. "Is that I got tired of being treated like a criminal for existing while black and first class?" Kai's eyes widened as he pulled up various social media feeds on his tablet. "Devon, look at this. The Pinnacle's Haim is trending worldwide. The video from that college girl Zoe, something has been viewed over 1 million times in the past hour. And Elena Vasquez just posted a preliminary story that's already being shared everywhere." Devon scanned the headlines that Kai showed him. Black CEO grounds own airline after racist treatment. Pinnacle Airways in crisis after discrimination incident. SkiTech CEO faces down racism at $30,000 theft the stock. Devon asked down 12% in after-hours trading. But here's the weird thing. SkiTech shares are up 8%. Investors seem to be viewing this as a positive leadership moment for you personally, even if they're concerned about Pinnacle's reputation. A woman in a Pinnacle Airways uniform approached them, her face grave. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Rebecca Santos, VP of Operations. I need to speak with you immediately about the incident on Flight 1947. Devon nodded. "Miss Santos, I assume you've been briefed on what happened." "I've seen the video." Rebecca replied, her tone carefully neutral. "And I've received preliminary reports from Captain Rodriguez and Flight Attendant Chen. Mr. Mitchell, I want you to know that Pinnacle Airways takes any allegation of discrimination very seriously and we're prepared to conduct a full investigation into the incident." "An investigation," Devon repeated slowly. "Miss Santos, are you investigating whether discrimination occurred, or are you investigating how to minimize the PR damage?" Rebecca's professional composure slipped slightly. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we need to handle this through proper channels. There are procedures for these kinds of complaints. And those procedures," Devon interrupted, "typically involve asking the victim to file a report that gets buried in a file somewhere, while the employees involved receive a brief reminder about customer service protocols. Is that about right?" Kai leaned closer to Devon and whispered, "The board is convening an emergency meeting in 2 hours. They want to know how you plan to handle this publicly." Devon was quiet for a moment, watching as the last passengers deplaned from Flight 1947. Zoe Kim emerged with her phone still recording, speaking rapidly to her camera about what she had witnessed. Captain Rodriguez and Sarah Chen exited together, both looking like they were walking to their own execution. "Ms. Santos," Devon said finally, "I want you to understand something. This isn't going to be handled through normal procedures. This isn't going to be buried in a file or resolved with diversity training and a public apology. This is going to be handled publicly, transparently, and completely." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Mitchell, with respect, I think you should consider the broader implications of making this a public spectacle. The airline industry is highly regulated, and the FAA takes a very dim view of using aircraft for personal grievances." Devon almost smiled at that. Personal grievances is Santos. "Do you think what happened on that aircraft was a personal grievance? I think it was a misunderstanding that escalated due to poor communication and unfortunate assumptions on all sides," Rebecca replied carefully. Elena Vasquez had finished her phone call and was now approaching the group, her press credentials clearly visible and her notepad ready. "Mr. Mitchell, Elena Vasquez, Washington Post. Could I get a comment on Pinnacle Airways' response to today's incident?" Devon looked at Rebecca Santos, then at Elena, then at the small crowd of media personnel who were now gathering near the gate. "Ms. Vasquez, I'll be making a full statement shortly, but I will say this. What happened today on Flight 1947 is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of systemic problems in the airline industry, and those problems are going to be addressed comprehensively." Rebecca stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Mitchell, I really think we should discuss this privately before making any public statements. There are liability issues to consider. And Ms. Santos Devon said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him one of the youngest CEOs in the Fortune 500. I own this airline. I don't need to discuss liability issues with my own employees. What I need is for you to immediately suspend Captain Rodriguez and Sarah Chen pending a full investigation, implement mandatory bias training for all customer-facing personnel, and prepare a comprehensive report on discrimination complaints filed against Pinnacle Airways over the past 5 years. Rebecca's mouth fell open. Sir, that's not how we typically handle these situations. Union contracts require specific procedures for disciplinary actions and then change the procedures. Devon said simply, I want those suspensions processed within the hour. I want the training program designed and implemented within 60 days, and I want that discrimination report on my desk by the end of the week. Kai was typing rapidly on his tablet, documenting Devon's instructions. I'm sending these directives to legal and HR right now, he murmured. Elena Vasquez looked up from her notepad. Mr. Mitchell, are you planning to make changes beyond just Pinnacle Airways? Your company's software is used by most major airlines. Do you see this as an industry-wide problem? Devon considered the question carefully. Through the large windows overlooking the tarmac, he could see Flight 47 being serviced for its eventual departure to Los Angeles. In a few hours, it would be just another routine flight, carrying passengers who had no idea that they had been part of a moment that was about to reshape how airlines thought about discrimination and customer service. Ms. Vasquez Devon said what happened today could happen on any airline in any airport, to any person who doesn't fit someone else's preconceptions about who belongs where. The fact that it happened to me, someone with the power and platform to do something about it, means that it's my responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Rebecca Santos was speaking urgently into her own phone, presumably reporting back to Pinnacle's executive team about Devon's demands. Devon could hear fragments of her conversation, completely unreasonable. Union issues, PR nightmare. Devon's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He glanced at it quickly and saw Mr. Mitchell. This is Zoe Kim from the flight. My video has 2.3 million views and counting. I wanted you to know that 99% of the comments are supporting you. People are sharing their own stories of airline discrimination. This is becoming something huge. Kai Devon said, I want you to reach out to that college student Zoe Kim. Offer her an interview with our corporate communications team. If she's willing, I want her to be part of the solution going forward. Elena Vasquez had been watching this exchange with growing interest. Mr. Mitchell, it sounds like you're planning something much bigger than just addressing one incident. Are you thinking about systematic changes across the entire industry? Devon looked at her for a long moment, then at the small crowd of reporters who were now hanging on his every word, then at Rebecca Santos, who was still speaking frantically into her phone. Ms. Vasquez, he said, I'm thinking about making sure that what happened to me today never happens to anyone else ever, regardless of what airline they're flying, what they're wearing, or how much money they have in their bank account. He paused, looking around at the faces watching him, all waiting to see what the young black CEO would do with the platform that discrimination had inadvertently given him. I'm thinking about changing everything. As if on cue, his phone rang. The caller ID showed CNN Newsroom. Devon looked at the phone, then at Elena Vasquez, then at the crowd of people who were documenting every moment of what was clearly becoming a major news story. He answered the call. This is Devon Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, this is Jake Tapper from CNN. I'm calling about the incident on Pinnacle Airways Flight 1847. Would you be willing to do a live interview within the next 30 minutes? Devon glanced around at the crowd that had gathered in the gate area. What had started as a simple flight delay had evolved into a media circus with reporters, airport officials, and curious passengers creating an impromptu press conference atmosphere around Gate C7. Mr. Tapper Devon said, putting the call on speaker so that Elena Vasquez and the other journalists could hear. I'll be happy to speak with you, but I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about one incident on one flight. This is about systematic discrimination that happens every day in the airline industry, and I'm planning to do something about it. Jake Tapper's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker. "Mr. Mitchell, we've seen the video that's gone viral, and we've been in contact with several passengers from Flight 1947. Can you tell us exactly what happened from your perspective?" Devon looked directly into Elena Vasquez's eyes as he answered, "What happened is that I was treated like a criminal and a fraud simply because I'm a black man who had the audacity to sit in a first-class seat." Mrs. Victoria Hartwell took my assigned seat and refused to move, despite having no boarding pass for that seat. When I asked her to move, she suggested that I didn't belong in first class and accused me of running some kind of compensation scam. Rebecca Santos stepped closer, making frantic gestures for Devon to end the call, but he ignored her completely. The flight attendant, Sarah Chen, suggested that I should be the one to move to avoid trouble, even though I had the legitimate seat assignment. Captain Rodriguez endorsed that suggestion and implied that I should be flexible to accommodate Mrs. Hartwell's preferences. When I refused to give up my seat, Mrs. Hartwell escalated to personal attacks, including references to affirmative action and the phrase, "You people." Murmurs rippled through the crowd of listeners as Devon laid out the timeline of events. Several people were recording with their phones, and Devon could see Kai taking detailed notes on his tablet. Mr. Mitchell, Jake Tapper continued, "We understand that you ultimately grounded the aircraft. Can you explain that decision?" Devon pulled out his phone and held it up so the crowd could see the SkyTech CEO app that was still open on his screen. "Mr. Tapper, what many people don't realize is that I'm not just a passenger who is discriminated against. Through my company, SkyTech Innovations, I own 65% of Pinnacle Airways. When it became clear that my own employees were willing to tolerate and enable discriminatory behavior rather than simply enforce basic fairness, I used my authority as the majority owner to ground the flight." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Even though some of them had witnessed the moment on the aircraft, hearing it explained in this context made the full implications clear. "You grounded your own airline?" Tapper asked, his voice carrying a note of amazement. "I grounded one flight," Devon corrected to make a point about accountability. "Mrs. Hartwell, Captain Rodriguez and Sarah Chen all assumed that they could treat me however they wanted because they believed I had no power to do anything about it. They were wrong." Rebecca Santos was now speaking urgently into her own phone, presumably getting instructions from Pinnacle's board of directors about how to handle the rapidly escalating situation. Devon could hear fragments of her conversation. Stock price legal implications, damage control. Elena Vasquez stepped forward and spoke loudly enough for the phone to pick up her voice. "Mr. Mitchell, Elena Vasquez from the Washington Post. What do you plan to do going forward? Is this just about Pinnacle Airways, or are you thinking about broader changes?" Devon smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Ms. Vasquez, I'm planning to revolutionize how the airline industry handles discrimination, starting immediately. Pinnacle Airways will implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination training and reporting system in the industry. But that's just the beginning." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him with growing anticipation. SkyTech's reservation software powers booking and passenger management systems for over 70% of commercial airlines in North America. We're going to integrate bias detection and reporting mechanisms directly into those systems. If a passenger files a discrimination complaint, it will be automatically escalated to corporate level and tracked until resolution. No more burying complaints in local files or dismissing them as misunderstandings. Jake Tapper's voice carried excitement. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, are you saying you're going to use your technological platform to force industry-wide changes in how airlines handle discrimination? I'm saying I'm going to use every tool at my disposal to make sure that what happened to me today never happens to anyone else," Devon replied. "And if other airlines don't want to participate voluntarily, they can find different software providers." The implications of that statement hit the crowd like a physical force. SkyTech's near monopoly on airline reservation systems meant that Devon Mitchell could effectively force industry-wide policy changes simply by updating his software. Kai looked up from his tablet, his eyes wide. Devon Twitter is exploding. Systemic change is now trending alongside Pinnacle shame. Stock futures are reacting in real time. Airlines are down, but tech stocks focused on social justice are surging. Rebecca Santos finally ended her phone call and approached Devon with what appeared to be a mixture of desperation and resignation on her face. "Mr. Mitchell, I've just spoken with our board chairman. He wants to know if there's any way we can resolve this situation privately before it becomes a larger crisis." Devon looked at her for a long moment, then at the crowd of reporters and onlookers who were hanging on every word of his conversation with CNN. "Ms. Santos," he said, making sure his voice carried clearly through Jake Tapper's phone connection. "The time for private resolution was when your employees first decided to discriminate against me. That opportunity passed when Captain Rodriguez endorsed the discrimination. It was completely gone when Mrs. Hartwell started making references to affirmative action and you people." He held up his phone so everyone could see the screen. "This is no longer about one flight or one incident. This is about using the platform that discrimination inadvertently gave me to create lasting systematic change." "Mr. Mitchell." Jake Tapper's voice came through the speaker. "We're getting reports that your story is trending internationally now. People are sharing their own experiences with airline discrimination, and several civil rights organizations have already issued statements supporting your actions. Do you see this as a turning point for the industry?" Devon considered the question carefully. Around him, the crowd had grown to include not just journalists and airport personnel, but passengers from other flights who had heard about the incident and come to witness the impromptu press conference. "Mr. Tapper," Devon said, "finally I see this as a moment when someone with power decided to use that power responsibly. For too long, discrimination in air travel has been treated as a customer service issue rather than a civil rights violation. That stops today." He looked directly into Elena Vasquez's eyes as he continued. "I have the resources, the platform, and the technology to force changes that civil rights advocates have been fighting for decades. The only question was whether I would choose to use those advantages to benefit just myself or to create opportunities for everyone who looks like me." Rebecca Santos stepped forward one more time. "Mr. Mitchell, please, I'm begging you to consider the broader implications. Thousands of people work for Pinnacle Airways. The changes you're talking about could have massive economic impacts." Devon's expression hardened. "Ms. Santos, are you suggesting that I should tolerate discrimination to protect the economic interests of a company that employs people who discriminate against customers?" The question hung in the air unanswered because Rebecca Santos clearly realized that any response would be problematic. Jake Tapper's voice came through the phone again. "Mr. Mitchell, we're going to break for a commercial, but when we come back, I'd like to discuss the specific policy changes you're planning to implement. Are you available for a full interview in our New York studio tomorrow morning?" Devon looked at Kai, who was already checking schedules on his tablet. "Mr. Tapper, I'll be there, and I'll have a comprehensive announcement about the future of anti-discrimination efforts in the airline industry." As he ended the call with CNN, Devon realized that he had just committed himself to a course of action that would reshape not just his own company, but potentially the entire airline industry. The young black CEO who had just wanted to fly home in peace had become the focal point of a national conversation about discrimination power and corporate responsibility. The question now was whether he was ready for everything that came next. As Devon ended his call with CNN, the crowd around Gate C7 had swelled to include what appeared to be half the terminal. Airport security had cordoned off the area, but people pressed against the barriers holding up phones to record what everyone seemed to understand was a historic moment. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, her press credentials getting her through the security barrier. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you something directly. You've just committed to revolutionizing airline anti-discrimination policies on live television. Are you prepared for the pushback you're going to face? The airline industry isn't known for embracing change, especially when it's imposed from the outside." Devon considered her question while watching Zoe Kim, the college student, whose live stream had first brought the incident to national attention. She was now interviewing other passengers from Flight 1947, documenting their reactions to what they had witnessed. Her viewer count visible on her phone screen had climbed to over 50,000 concurrent viewers. Ms. Vasquez Devon replied, "I'm not imposing change from the outside. I own the systems that these airlines depend on. When they purchased our software, they entered into contracts that give me significant leverage over their operations. If they want to continue using SkyTech's reservation and passenger management systems, they'll implement the anti-discrimination measures I'm developing." Kai looked up from his tablet, his expression grave. "Devon, I'm getting calls from airlines across the country. United, Delta, American. They're all asking for emergency meetings. Some are threatening to find alternative software providers." Devon almost laughed at that. Kai, it would take them 3 to 5 years to replace our systems, assuming they could find providers with the capacity to handle their volume. And every day they delay is another day that their current discrimination policies remain in place, which means another day of social media scrutiny and negative press coverage. Rebecca Santos had been speaking quietly with a group of Pinnacle executives who had arrived during the CNN interview. Now she approached Devon with what appeared to be a prepared statement. "Mr. Mitchell, on behalf of Pinnacle Airways, I want to offer you our sincerest apology for the incident on Flight 1947. We are prepared to implement immediate policy changes, provide additional training to our staff, and work with you to ensure that this type of situation never happens again." Devon studied her for a moment. "Ms. Santos, how many times has Pinnacle Airways issued that exact apology in the past 5 years?" Rebecca looked confused. "I'm sorry. How many times has your airline apologized for discrimination incidents and promised to do better? How many times have you implemented training programs and policy changes that somehow never prevent the next incident from occurring?" Rebecca's silence was answer enough. Elena Vasquez was taking detailed notes. "Mr. Mitchell, are you suggesting that standard corporate apologies and training programs are insufficient? I'm suggesting that they're performative rather than substantive." Devon replied, "Airlines apologize. They provide sensitivity training. They update their customer service guidelines. And then 6 months later, we read about another passenger being dragged off a plane or humiliated because of their race or religion or appearance." He pulled out his phone and showed the screen to Elena and the other reporters who had gathered within earshot. "This is different. This is systemic change built into the technology that airlines can't operate without." On his screen was a new interface that hadn't existed an hour ago. A real-time discrimination reporting and tracking system that Kai had apparently been developing while Devon handled the media interviews. "Every passenger interaction will be logged," Devon explained. "Every complaint will be escalated automatically. Every pattern of discriminatory behavior will trigger immediate intervention. Airlines won't be able to bury these incidents or dismiss them as isolated events because the data will be transparent and publicly available." Zoe Kim had finished her interviews and was now approaching the main group. "Mr. Mitchell," she called out, "can I ask you something? My viewers, and there are like 75,000 of them now, want to know what you would say to other people who experience discrimination but don't have the power to ground an airline." The question stopped Devon cold in the excitement of technological solutions and corporate policy changes. He had almost forgotten that his ability to respond to discrimination was unique. Most people who faced what he had faced on Flight 1847 would have had no recourse except to file complaints that would likely be ignored. That's Devon paused, the weight of the question settling on him. That's exactly why this has to be bigger than just one incident or one airline. Most people can't ground a flight when they're discriminated against. Most people can't force corporate policy changes or get live television interviews to tell their stories. He looked around at the crowd of people who had gathered to witness his impromptu press conference. "But I can. And because I can, I have to. Not just for me, but for every person who looks like me and has been told they don't belong somewhere. Every person who has been questioned about their credentials because of their skin color. Every person who has been asked to be flexible when what they really needed was basic human dignity." Elena Vasquez looked up from her notepad. "Mr. Mitchell, that sounds like you're positioning this as a civil rights issue rather than just a customer service problem." "Because it is a civil rights issue," Devon replied firmly. "When airlines systematically treat people differently based on race. when they dismiss complaints about discrimination as misunderstandings, when they ask victims to be flexible rather than holding perpetrators accountable. That's not customer service. That's institutional racism. Rebecca Santos stepped forward again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Mr. Mitchell, I think you're painting the entire industry with a very broad brush. Pinnacle Airways serves millions of passengers every year, and the vast majority of those interactions are positive. Devon turned to look at her directly. Ms. Santos, how many discrimination complaints has Pinnacle Airways received in the past year? Rebecca hesitated. I don't have those numbers with me. Kai Devon said, pull up Pinnacle's complaint data from our customer service integration system. Kai's fingers flew across his tablet screen. Devon, in the past 12 months, Pinnacle Airways received 847 complaints that included keywords related to discrimination bias or unfair treatment. Of those, 23 were escalated beyond the initial customer service response. 0 resulted in policy changes or staff disciplinary actions. The crowd fell silent as the implications of those numbers sank in. Over 800 complaints, and virtually nothing had been done about any of them. Elena Vasquez was writing furiously. Mr. Mitchell, are those numbers representative of the industry as a whole? Devon nodded grimly. According to our data, which comes from airlines that use our customer service management software, the industry receives approximately 15,000 discrimination-related complaints annually. Fewer than 2% result in meaningful action by the airlines. 15,000. Elena repeated. Mr. Mitchell, are you saying that there are 15,000 incidents like yours every year and airlines simply ignore them? I'm saying that what happened to me today wasn't unusual, Devon replied. What was unusual was that I had the power to do something about it, and now I'm going to use that power to make sure that every one of those 15,000 annual complaints gets the attention and response it deserves. Zoe Kim held up her phone so everyone could see the comment stream from her live stream. Mr. Mitchell people are sharing their own stories in the comments, hundreds of them. People saying they've experienced exactly what you experienced, but they didn't have any way to fight back. Devon looked at the stream of comments flowing across Zoe's screen. Story after story of people who had been questioned, humiliated, or dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's expectations about who belonged where. That's going to change. Devon said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the crowd pay attention. Starting today, every person who experiences discrimination on any airline that uses SkiTech software will have a direct line to corporate executives who will be required to respond within 24 hours. No more buried complaints, no more institutional silence. He looked around at the faces watching him. Journalists, airline executives, airport personnel, and ordinary passengers who had stumbled into witnessing a historic moment. This isn't about revenge, Devon said. This is about justice. And justice delayed, justice denied. As Devon finished speaking, Zoe Kim's phone erupted with notifications. Her live stream, which had started with a few hundred followers documenting what seemed like a simple airline dispute, had become the epicenter of a social media earthquake that was reshaping public discourse about discrimination in real time. Mr. Mitchell called out a young black woman who appeared to be leading the group. I'm Jasmine Rodriguez, a junior at Howard University studying computer science and civil rights law. Your work inspired me to pursue a career in tech advocacy. Devon stopped to speak with the students, remembering his own college years when civil rights seemed like something that happened in history books rather than through software algorithms and corporate policy changes. Jasmine, what are you hoping to do after graduation? Devon asked. I want to work on expanding anti-discrimination technology beyond transportation, she replied enthusiastically. Housing, healthcare, education, employment, every industry where bias affects people's opportunities. You've shown that technology companies have both the power and the responsibility to enforce civil rights. As Devon spoke with the students, he noticed an older black woman watching their conversation from nearby. When she approached, he recognized her as Dr. Beverly Williams, the civil rights attorney who had testified alongside him at congressional hearings about technological solutions to discrimination. Devon Dr. Williams said, joining the group, "I wanted to let you know that the Civil Rights Technology Institute just received a $50 million grant from the Ford Foundation to expand bias prevention systems to K-12 education. Your model is being replicated everywhere." Devon felt a profound sense of satisfaction at that news. Education had been one of the sectors where discrimination was most persistent and most harmful, and technological accountability could help ensure that all students received equal treatment and opportunities. Dr. Williams, how is the educational technology being received by school districts? Initially, there was resistance, just like we saw with airlines, she replied. But once districts realized that bias detection systems actually helped them identify and support struggling students more effectively, the opposition faded quickly. It turns out that reducing discrimination doesn't just help the students who are being discriminated against. It improves outcomes for everyone. As they walked toward the boarding area, Devon noticed that the gate agent was a young black man whose professional demeanor and confident interactions with passengers of all backgrounds reflected the culture change that had swept through the airline industry. His name tag read, Kevin Martinez, Customer Advocacy Specialist, a new position created to ensure that passenger concerns were addressed immediately and effectively. Mr. Mitchell Kevin said, as Devon approached, "I wanted to personally thank you. I've been working in airline customer service for 6 years, and your systems have completely changed how we do our jobs. Instead of being trained to avoid problems, we're now trained to solve them." Devon checked in for his flight receiving the same efficient and respectful service that all passengers now received, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. The boarding process moved smoothly with crew members who seemed genuinely committed to treating every traveller with dignity. As he settled into seat 2A, the same seat that had started everything, Devon reflected on the journey that had brought him from a frustrated passenger to a global leader in civil rights technology. His phone displayed messages from colleagues around the world who were implementing similar systems in their own countries and industries. Elena Vasquez, now a Pulitzer Prize winner for her coverage of the discrimination technology movement, had texted Devon, "The UN is voting next week on global standards for bias prevention in transportation. Your model is becoming international law." Zoe Kim, who had parlayed her viral live stream into a successful career as a civil rights documentary filmmaker, had shared a video from the premiere of her new film about technological solutions to systemic racism. "Devon, thank you for showing the world that going viral for justice can create lasting change." As the aircraft prepared for departure, Devon opened his laptop and reviewed the latest data from Skitech's Civil Rights Division. In the past 24 hours, discrimination prevention systems had processed over 3 million passenger interactions across 47 countries, automatically flagging 247 potential bias incidents for immediate intervention and successfully resolving 892 complaints that might otherwise have been ignored. More importantly, the data showed that the actual rate of discriminatory incidents continued to decline as employees became more conscious of their unconscious biases and passengers became more confident that their concerns would be addressed fairly and promptly. The flight attendant making the safety announcement was Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to Director of Inclusive Customer Experience for Pinnacle Airways. After her advocacy for discrimination, prevention had been vindicated. Her presence on this particular flight was intentional. Pinnacle Airways had asked her to work Flight 1947 as a symbol of how far the industry had come. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced over the intercom, "welcome aboard Pinnacle Airways Flight 1847. As we prepare for departure, I want to remind you that this airline is committed to ensuring that every passenger travels with dignity and respect, regardless of background or appearance." She paused, looking directly at Devon. 2 years ago, this flight was the site of a discrimination incident that sparked a global movement for civil rights and transportation. Today, thanks to the courage of passengers who refuse to accept unfair treatment and the technology that makes accountability possible, air travel is safer and more welcoming for everyone. As the aircraft lifted off, Devon looked out the window at the city where he had built a technology empire that was now being used to enforce civil rights around the world. His phone displayed a notification from the White House informing him that the president would be signing the Digital Civil Rights Act legislation inspired by his work the following week. But Devon's attention was drawn to a conversation happening across the aisle, where a young Latina girl was asking her grandmother about the dignity and travel displays throughout the aircraft. "Abuela, what do those screens mean?" the girl asked in Spanish. Her grandmother smiled and replied also in Spanish. "They mean that people like us are welcome here, Mika. They mean that we don't have to worry about being treated badly because of how we look or where we come from." Devon understood enough Spanish to follow the conversation, and he realized that this was the real measure of success. Not the awards or the congressional hearings or the international recognition, but the simple fact that a young girl could travel without fear of discrimination because someone had refused to accept unfair treatment and had used his power to create systematic change. As Flight 1847 continued toward Miami, Devon began drafting his speech for the next day's Civil Rights Technology Summit, where he would announce the expansion of bias prevention systems to healthcare, education, and housing. The movement that had started with one black CEO refusing to give up his airplane seat had become a global revolution in how technology could be used to enforce human dignity. The plane that had once been grounded for justice was now flying toward a future where discrimination was no longer tolerated because it was no longer invisible. And Devon Mitchell, the young CEO who had simply wanted to sit in his assigned seat, had become the architect of the most significant advancement in civil rights technology in human history. The circle was complete, but the revolution was just beginning. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about standing up for what's right, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed discrimination? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up? Share your story with our community. And if you believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how much money they have or what they look like, then this video deserves your support. Hit that like button right now to help this message reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss stories about people who refuse to accept injustice and use their power to create positive change in the world. We are building a community of people who believe that technology should serve justice, not just profit. Share this video with your friends, your family, your co-workers. Post it on your social media. Send it to that person you know who has the power to make a difference but hasn't found the courage to use it yet. Because sometimes all it takes is one story, one example, one person standing up to change everything. The revolution Devon Mitchell started on Flight 1847 didn't end when the plane landed. It's still happening every day in every industry, wherever people with power choose to use that power responsibly, and it's waiting for you to be part of it. So, what are you going to do with the power you have? How are you going to use your voice, your influence, your platform, to make sure that what happened to Devon never happens to anyone else? The future of civil rights isn't just about technology. It's about people like you choosing to care enough to act. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let's change the world together, one story at a time. Because dignity isn't negotiable, justice isn't optional, and your voice matters more than you know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make our world more fair and just for everyone. 1.